Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone. Hope you are doing well. So in today's lesson, I'll explain you all the macroeconomics graphs, right, that are basically in the syllabus of A-level economics, right? So A2 economics basically. So there are a very limited number of graphs that you can use in your answers. And let me show you what are those graphs. The first graph that you must know is aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. So ADAS curves. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves are generally drawn in two ways. One is like simple aggregate demand curve that is negatively sloped, and simple aggregate supply curve in the short term that is positively sloped. This is short term aggregate supply curve, and this is origin point on X. We plot real GDP, so you must like remember and try to memorize these variables that are used in this graph. You cannot write quantity here. What generally students do is students write quantity demand or quantity supplied here, so that is incorrect. Rather you should write real GDP or output, real output. And on y-axis generally students write price, so instead of price you have to now write price level or average price, because in macroeconomics we don't consider only price of a single product, rather it is the average prices of all goods and services produced in a country. And equilibrium takes place at point E, where price level is P and real GDP is Y. Okay, so now you have to show the changes in this equilibrium price and quantity as well. So it depends upon the type of government policy used to achieve multiple macroeconomic objectives, and policies are divided into demand side and supply side policies. So if examiner uses demand side policy, expansionary demand side policies like expansionary fiscal and expansionary monetary policies, then you have to shift aggregate demand curve to the right. Generally when examiner asks the question about like increase in investment, increase in foreign direct investment, like inflow of multinational companies, then you must use this graph. So we have now new equilibrium at E1, where you can see that real GDP has increased to Y1, which shows economic growth in the country, and price level increased to P1, which shows demand pull inflation. So this policy, expansionary fiscal and monetary policies, have resulted in increase in GDP or economic growth of the country and increase in price level as well. So increase in price level is inflation, and increase in real GDP is economic growth. And rise in aggregate demand also creates job opportunities, so aggregate so unemployment will also decrease. And if government uses contractionary fiscal and monetary policies, then aggregate demand will shift to the left, and aggregate demand will move to AD2, and equilibrium will move to like E2 at this point, E2, and now real GDP will decrease to Y2 and price level will decrease to P2. So this is P2. So this policy, contractionary demand side policy, leads to fall in price and fall in real GDP. Another graph, aggregate demand and supply diagram, that generally you need to draw is like long run aggregate supply curve. And in the long run, as per the Kenesian school of thought, aggregate supply curve is initially horizontal straight line, then it is positively sloped, and after a certain point it will be a vertical straight line. So this is long run aggregate supply curve. And again we label price level on Y, so this is price level or average price. So this is origin point on X. We have real GDP or real output, real GDP or real output, you can write any one of them. An aggregate demand curve is a normal demand curve, negatively sloped like this, and this is AD, and this point of equilibrium is also known as full employment. Okay, so this is full employment. Full employment when full employment is achieved, aggregate supply curve becomes vertical straight line. So this segment of aggregate supply curve, vertical straight line, shows full employment in the economy. And now if there is increase in aggregate demand, then aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. So price level will increase, but real GDP will remain the same. So you can see that real GDP at this point is Y, and increase in aggregate demand shifted aggregate demand curve to the right, and equilibrium moves from E to E1, where price level will rise to P1. Initially it was P and now it will be P1. So this gap basically represents inflationary gap. Okay, so this graph shows that increase in aggregate demand, which may be due to increase in consumption, government expenditure, net exports, or because of greater investments in the economy because of multinational companies or the local investment. Since the economy was already at full employment, so real GDP will not rise, rather price will accelerate, inflation rate will accelerate. But sometimes you can make the graph initial aggregate demand curve. Let me make another graph for you so that you are not confused what I am saying right now. And for example, aggregate supply is initially horizontal straight line, then it is positive, then it is vertical. When full employment is achieved, long run aggregate supply curve will become a vertical straight line. So we have price level on y-axis, and we have real GDP here on x, or real output, and this is origin point. Let's say initially aggregate demand curve was at this point. This was the initial aggregate demand curve, and this is AD, where equilibrium takes place at E and real GDP is Y, price level is P. Now if there is rise in aggregate demand, then aggregate demand curve will shift to the right, and new aggregate demand curve will be AD1, equilibrium will move to E1, and real GDP will rise to Y1, and price level will rise to P1. So now price level increased as well as economic growth increased or real GDP increased. So if economy is operating below the full employment level, then rise in aggregate demand will cause economic growth as well as rise in real GDP. So whenever examiner asks about multinational companies or increase in investments or increase in government expenditure, then you can make this graph as well. So these graphs were the replacement for each other, so you can pick any one of them while answering the question. And then is real GDP. We plot real GDP on x. I think aggregate demand and supply curves are complete. Now we have another graph, that is production possibility curve, PPC. So in macro and micro both you can use this graph PPC. While we make PPC diagram, that is production possibility curve, we showed two different types of goods. One is, let's say, agricultural goods on x, and on y, let's say we have industrial goods, right? So these are two types of goods, industrial and agricultural goods. And initially production possibility curve is this one OAB, which shows that resources are limited to OAB. Now if there is rise in production possibilities, maybe because of multinational companies, because of foreign direct investment, or increase in local investment or improvement in technology, then PPC will completely shift to the right, or there may be discovery of new natural resources as well. So this is another important graph that you can make when you have to show the macroeconomic impact of increase in investment, multinational companies or foreign direct investment. And sometimes aid can also bring this kind of change. If government of Pakistan or government of any country gets foreign aid, then if that aid is productively used, then it will lead to increase in production possibilities. And another important graph is the graph of 45-degree line, which is used to show the multiplier impact on the GDP of a country. So we have GDP on x, and we have aggregate expenditure on y. AE stands for aggregate expenditure, and we draw a Kenesian 45-degree line, and this 45-degree line represents that aggregate expenditure and income are proportionate to each other if we move along the 45-degree line, and this is the basic math concept. And now we have to like draw aggregate expenditure line. Actual aggregate expenditure line looks like this. So aggregate expenditure is AE is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So this is aggregate expenditure line. So we have initial equilibrium in the economy at E where real GDP is Y. And now if there is increase in aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure because of increase in investment or any other component mentioned here, right? So then aggregate expenditure line will shift upward to AE1 and new equilibrium will move to E1 where real GDP will rise to Y1. So this rise in investment from this point to this point has resulted in rise in real GDP or change in income from Y to Y1. So rise in real GDP will be multiple times more than the rise in investment. So whenever investment increases in an economy, maybe in the form of multinational companies or local companies, or maybe increase in government expenditure, then a little increase in investment will lead to a multiple times increase in national income or GDP, and it is also known as multiplier effect. Multiplier is some constant value which shows that increase in investment leads to a multiple times increase in national income, and multiplier is also written as multiplier is equal to change in income over change in investment. Let's assume that multiplier is equal to 5 and we increase investment or change investment by $100. This delta sign is used for change in economics. So then what should be the change in income? You can just put these values here in the graph in the formula. So 5 is equal to change in income over 100. So what you have to do is just cross multiply these values. So change in income will be equal to 100 into 5 is equal to 500. So 5 times increase in national income. And another important graph that you must know in macroeconomics is Laffer curve, and Laffer curve is a graph which shows that when countries start developing, initially disparities increase or Gini coefficient increase, but eventually it falls, right? So when countries start developing, so this is development, on X I'm showing development, or on Y axis I'm showing inequalities, right? So before making Laffer curve, let me show you the Kuznets curve. Kuznets curve is the graph that shows inequalities initially increase when countries start developing, and eventually disparities or inequalities or Gini coefficient start decreasing. So this is known as Kuznets curve. Kuznets curve. Kuznets was an economist who suggested that when countries start developing, initially inequalities increase. For example, initially when GDP was this much, Y1, inequalities were, let's say, E equal to E1, and when basically development increases and real GDP increases in the country, inequalities will further rise to E2. But when countries develop further and their real GDP increases to Y3, then now what happens is inequalities will start falling, right? So inequalities decreases and initially it increases. So Kuznets basically explained this idea using the concept of rural urban migration, and he suggested that he used the example of rural urban migration and said that when countries develop initially, like their inequalities increase because as people from rural areas to urban areas migrate to urban areas, initially industrialists basically offer them low wages and for longer working hours. So as a result, industrialists' profit will increase because their cost of production will be low because they are paying low wages to to the newly migrated rural workers to the urban areas, to the industrial areas. So as a result, cost of production for the industrialists will fall and their profits will increase. So when profit of the industrialists increases while the income of these poor people is low, then the income gap between rich and poor will further widen or increase. But eventually, when these workers are well aware about the wages prevailing in the market in the cities, and they also get some new skill, and they also build good relationship with the people working with them, and sometimes in the neighboring industries as well. So what happens is they demand high wages. Then when they demand high wages, their income will increase, so the poor class will get more income now, and when they are paid high wages, the cost of production for industrialists will increase and their profits will decrease. So industrials income of industrial workers industrialists will fall, and the income of these poor working class will increase. So as a result, income inequalities will decrease. So this is how Kuznets basically used the idea of rural urban migration to explain that when countries develop, they initially cause increase in disparities, but eventually disparities decrease. Disparities are basically income gap between the rich and poor. So initially the income gap between rich and poor increases with development, but eventually it falls. And another graph that I was trying to explain you is Laffer curve. Laffer was another economist, and he suggested that suggested the relationship between tax revenue and tax rate charged by the government. So this is tax rate, and on y-axis we have tax revenue of the government. So this is tax revenue, and Laffer suggested that when government increases the tax rate, it initially increases tax revenue of the government, but eventually it falls, right? Because when tax rate is, let's say, R, tax revenue is, let's say, T. If tax rate increases to R1, tax revenue will increase to T1. So increase in tax rate has led to increase in tax revenue. Okay, so but when tax rate reaches this point, for example R3, then tax revenue of the government will decrease to T2, right? So because when government keeps increasing the tax rate, people think that it is really unfair for them, and they may stop paying taxes. They may try to avoid tax and evade tax as well, and they may not disclose their real incomes, actual incomes they are earning. So as a result, tax revenue of the government will fall because people will be reluctant to pay the taxes. So this is basically known as Laffer curve. Laffer was also an economist, and Laffer and Kuznets curves are exactly have the same shape, that is inverted U curve, but labeling is different. In case of Kuznets curve, we write GDP here or development here, and Gini coefficient on y-axis or inequalities. Gini coefficient is also a measure of inequalities. Greater the Gini coefficient, greater the inequalities exist in the society. But in Laffer curve, we use tax rate here and we use tax revenue here. Tax revenue is the tax income that is collected by the government. So these are the graphs that are basically used in macroeconomics. And another graph, one important graph that is used in money market is demand and supply of money, right? So demand for money and supply of money. In macroeconomics, money supply is vertical straight line in money market because money supply is fixed in a given period of time. So on X we have quantity of money, and this is money supply. On Y we have interest rate, right? And demand for money curve is negatively sloped initially, and after a certain point it may become a horizontal straight line, causing a liquidity trap. So this is demand for money, MD, let's say. So this will be the equilibrium point here in money market. Equilibrium quantity of money is Q and interest rate is I, and this is also known as critical rate of interest, because interest rate cannot fall further below I, right? So now if there is increase in money supply, then increase in money supply will not bring any kind of economic expansion in the country, because whatever money is supplied by the basically lenders, that will be trapped by the speculators, because they know that interest rate cannot fall further. Whenever there is a change in interest rate will go high, so they will use that money to deposit into the bank account and earn high interest rate. So you can see at E1 interest rate is still high, and this basically gap from E1 onwards, when money supply curve is a horizontal straight line, this is also known as liquidity trap, right? So this horizontal part is known as liquidity trap. So liquidity trap mean all the money that is available in the liquid form will be trapped by the speculators and kept with themselves for the future, because they know that this is the lowest possible interest rate and it cannot fall further, so they will trap all the money for future. And these are the important graphs of macroeconomics, almost all the graphs. Yeah, I have one more graph as well, that is the graph of loanable fund theory, like loanable fund theory. Loanable funds are basically the funds that are available for lending and borrowing with the commercial banks. These are the amounts of money that are that banks have available to give loan to the general public. So we have quantity of money, quantity of loanable fund on X, loanable fund, right? And this is demand of loanable fund, and this is supply of loanable fund, and on y-axis we have interest rate. So loanable fund theory suggests that interest rate is set at the intersection point of demand and supply of loanable funds, where quantity is set at Q and interest rate is set at I. Now if there is increase in demand for loanable funds or decrease in demand for loanable funds, interest rate will change accordingly, and if there is increase in supply of loanable funds, and then again interest rate will change accordingly. If there is increase in demand for loanable fund, then demand curve will shift to the right. If there is decrease, then it will shift to the left. So D1 is because of increase in demand of loanable funds, so equilibrium will move to E1, interest rate will rise to I1, and quantity will rise to Q1. And another like equilibrium is at E2, where quantity will fall to Q2, loanable funds, and interest rate will fall to I2. And similarly, examiner may like ask question about the changes in supply as well. So if there is increase in supply of loanable funds, then supply curve will shift to the right. So this is supply of loanable fund, and if there is decrease in supply of loanable fund, then supply will shift to the left. So if supply increases, equilibrium will move to E1, quantity of loanable funds will increase to Q1, but interest rate will fall to I1. And in case of fall in supply of loanable funds, equilibrium will move to E2, interest rate will rise to I2, and then quantity will fall to Q2. So these are the graphs of macroeconomics, and you must like practice them, memorize them, and apply them in your answers as well, right? So I believe you understand them. If you do, then thumb up and subscribe to this channel as well. See you with the next video that contains all the graphs of microeconomics. Allah Hafiz.